Everyone knows Kate Middleton's fairy tale, but nobody talks about what her parents lost to make it happen. Carole Goldsmith grew up in working-class London in the 1950s. Her dad was a builder, the kind who worked with his hands every single day. Her mom juggled part-time jobs to help pay the bills. There was no family money waiting in the background, no inheritance, no safety net if things went wrong. Just hard work and big dreams. From an early age, Carole learned that if you wanted something, you had to build it yourself. Nobody was going to hand it to you. That lesson shaped everything she did later in life. Michael Middleton came from a slightly better off family, but don't let that fool you. He wasn't rich. He wasn't connected to power. His family had some distant ties to British industry. Maybe a whisper of aristocratic lineage somewhere back in the family tree, but that meant nothing in practical terms. Michael worked for everything he had. He studied hard, followed the rules, and expected to earn his way through life. No shortcuts, no luxury, just steady, reliable effort. They met while working at British Airways in the 1970s. Both had jobs that demanded long hours, discipline, and attention to detail. Their relationship didn't start with romance or grand gestures. It started with shared schedules, shared responsibilities, and a shared understanding of what it meant to work hard. When they married in 1980, they weren't chasing fame or status. They were building a practical life based on employment and steady progress. The kind of life millions of people build every day. Their early years together were financially careful. They lived within their means. They saved what they could. When their first daughter, Catherine, was born, Carole left her job to focus on raising her. It was during this time that she noticed something interesting. Planning children's parties was surprisingly difficult. The supplies you needed were hard to find. Ordering was inconvenient. Parents didn't have good options. This wasn't some grand business revelation. It was just a practical observation from someone living through it. But Carole saw an opportunity. In 1987, she started Party Pieces from her kitchen table. It was a mail-order business, the kind you could run from home with a catalog and a phone line. There were no investors backing her, no big money to cushion mistakes, no headlines announcing a new venture. Just Carole, working alone, trying to solve a problem she noticed. Michael kept his job at British Airways at first, providing stability while the business found its footing. But as Party Pieces grew, he made a decision that carried real risk. He quit his steady airline job to help run the company full-time. Think about that for a moment. Leaving a secure position with benefits and a pension to bet everything on a family business. Their whole future now depended on whether this thing actually worked, and for years, it did work. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Party Pieces grew steadily. The company expanded its catalog, improved its distribution, and eventually moved into larger facilities. The Middleton children helped out informally, packing boxes during busy seasons, learning what it meant to run a business. The money that came in wasn't extravagant, but it was enough. More than enough. It paid for private school tuition. It paid for university. It paid for the kind of life the Middletons had worked toward. Here's what matters about this part of the story. The Middletons didn't inherit their way into comfort. They didn't marry into it. They didn't get lucky with investments. They earned it through business revenue. Every school fee, every tuition payment, every step up the social ladder came directly from what they built. That difference would later be ignored by critics who preferred simple stories about privilege and entitlement. But the truth is more complicated. They worked for what they had. By the time Kate met Prince William at the University of St Andrews in the early 2000s, her parents were financially comfortable. Not wealthy in the way royalty is wealthy, but stable, secure, living well. Their money was tied up in the business, though. That's an important detail. They didn't have wealth spread across multiple investments or properties. Everything depended on Party Pieces continuing to succeed. That dependency would later become a dangerous vulnerability. When Kate's relationship with William became public, everything changed for the Middleton family. Suddenly, reporters were digging into their background. Cameras followed them on ordinary errands. Their private choices became public discussion. Strangers debated their social position, their intentions, their worthiness. For the first time in their lives, the Middletons couldn't just be people living their lives. They were symbols, and symbols get judged constantly. Carole got hit the hardest. She was framed as pushy, ambitious, controlling, calculating. The media painted her as a social climber who had engineered her daughter's relationship with a prince. There was no evidence for any of this. It was just a story people wanted to believe. A woman who built a successful business and wanted good things for her children became suspicious simply because her daughter fell in love with someone famous. The label stuck, and once they did, they never fully went away. Michael stayed quieter, less visible, but the pressure affected him too. He was a man who valued privacy and routine, suddenly living under constant observation. Despite all this, the Middletons tried to maintain a normal life. They didn't sell stories to tabloids. They didn't do interviews seeking sympathy. They didn't trade on their connection to royalty. Their restraint was remarkable, actually, but it didn't protect them. The damage was already done. They were no longer just business owners. They were characters in a story they didn't write, and symbols get judged for everything, success and failure alike. Party pieces had always depended on one simple thing: people gathering to celebrate. Birthday parties, school events, weddings, anniversaries. The business model was built on predictable seasonal demand. Parents ordered supplies in advance. Stock moved consistently. Warehouses operated on reliable rhythms. For years, this worked perfectly, but that rhythm was more fragile than it appeared. The entire foundation rested on social gatherings continuing without interruption. Then 2020 arrived, and the pandemic changed everything. Within weeks, gatherings stopped. Parties were canceled. Schools closed. Weddings were postponed indefinitely. The demand that kept party pieces running collapsed almost overnight. This wasn't a gradual downturn that could be managed with adjustments. It was an abrupt halt. Orders dried up completely. Stock sat unmoved in warehouses. But the costs didn't stop. Warehousing fees continued. Staff obligations remained. Supplier invoices kept arriving. For a business built entirely on celebration, there was suddenly nothing to celebrate and no clear path to recovery. Around this time, Carole stepped back from day-to-day operations. Reports suggest she did this to focus on family responsibilities and address health concerns. The timing couldn't have been worse. The company desperately needed strong, decisive leadership during an unprecedented crisis. Instead, it entered survival mode with no clear direction. Losses started building up quietly. Credit was extended. Payments were delayed. Everyone hoped for a post-pandemic rebound that would fix everything. That rebound never fully came. When restrictions finally lifted, consumer behavior had changed permanently. People were more cautious with money. Inflation was rising. Large parties were replaced by smaller, more intimate gatherings. The old model didn't fit the new reality. Party pieces tried to adapt. They adjusted inventory, looked for outside investment, attempted restructuring. None of it was enough. The scale that had once made the business profitable now worked against it. Overhead became crushing. Fixed cost became anchors dragging everything down. In 2023, party pieces entered administration. That's the British term for what Americans would call bankruptcy protection. The numbers told a harsh story. The company owed more than £2.5 million to various creditors. Some were major institutions that could absorb the loss, but others weren't. One creditor that drew significant media attention was a small, family-run business operated by Afghan refugees. They had supplied products to party pieces and were left unpaid. When that detail spread, public opinion hardened immediately. The Middletons were now accused of benefiting from their royal connections while leaving vulnerable people to absorb their losses. There was no evidence they had hidden assets or acted dishonestly, but perception overtook fact. The story shifted from business misfortune to moral failure. Carole and Michael faced the embarrassment of watching decades of work reduced to headlines about collapse and debt. Their business identity was erased. Their personal integrity was questioned publicly. For Carole, the emotional toll was severe. Party Pieces wasn't just a company to her. It was her creation. It had grown alongside her children. Watching it fail publicly while being unable to defend herself created a sense of powerlessness that people close to her reportedly noticed. Michael faced a different kind of strain. As someone who valued structure, predictability, and privacy, the chaos of administration proceedings and constant media speculation cut deeply. Every attempt to maintain dignity was undermined by the company's connection to the royal family. The headlines were brutal. People accused the family of using royal connections improperly, of living beyond their means, of abandoning responsibility. There was no proof of any of this, but the story was too compelling. Social climbers rise to high, get too close to power, and then fall spectacularly. It fit a narrative people wanted to believe. What made everything worse was how personal it became. In Bucklebury, the quiet village where the Middletons had lived peacefully for years, anonymous posters began appearing. These weren't abstract criticisms of corporate failure. They were targeted attacks that named the family directly and accused them of wrongdoing. For people who had deliberately kept a low profile, this was a psychological turning point. Their privacy had been violated not by distant paparazzi, but by neighbors. Places that had once felt safe now carried tension. Trust eroded in their own community. Carole reportedly found this phase especially distressing. She could accept business failure. Markets change, pandemics happen, companies collapse. What she couldn't accept was the moral judgment. The idea that her intentions, her character, her years of work were being questioned by people who knew nothing about her. Michael reacted by withdrawing even further. People close to the family described him as increasingly reserved, limiting social interaction, avoiding anything public. This wasn't strategy, it was self-protection. Meanwhile, Kate was navigating her own intense pressures within the royal institution. Her parents' crisis unfolded alongside her own challenges, but she couldn't publicly acknowledge their struggle. Any visible support would have been interpreted as interference or favoritism. Any comment would have made headlines. Silence became mandatory, not optional. This created painful emotional distance in a family that had always been close. Support had to happen behind closed doors. Conversations became careful. Stress was absorbed quietly rather than shared openly. Then there was Gary Goldsmith, Carole's brother. His past included legal troubles and a reputation for volatile behavior. When he decided to participate in reality television, it reignited media interest in the extended family. Even though Gary had nothing to do with party pieces and limited involvement in the Middletons' lives, the media connected him to their story anyway. His individual choices became treated as collective family responsibility. This frustrated the Middletons deeply. They had spent years maintaining clear boundaries. Those boundaries collapsed under media simplification. The Middletons didn't issue public statements. They didn't distance themselves from Gary. They didn't attempt image rehabilitation. This restraint was interpreted by critics as indifference or arrogance. In reality, it reflected exhaustion and a belief that any response would only prolong the scrutiny. So they stayed silent and absorbed judgment they couldn't answer. After the initial storm passed, the Middletons didn't attempt to rebuild publicly. They didn't seek redemption or offer explanations. They simply withdrew. Social appearances declined. Public events were avoided. Their lives became smaller by necessity. This wasn't isolation driven by shame. It was an attempt to reclaim control over a life that had been steadily stripped of boundaries. Carole, once described as energetic and relentlessly hands-on, slowed noticeably. She had spent decades building something tangible. Now she faced the reality that building again would mean reopening wounds she couldn't afford to expose. Michael followed the same path. His response remained consistent throughout. Reduce risk, preserve privacy, protect what remains. The ambition that once defined their household was replaced by caution. This wasn't defeat, it was survival. Kate's position during all of this was impossibly complex. As Princess of Wales, her public responsibilities expanded even as her parents' world contracted. She couldn't acknowledge their pain without creating more problems. Distance was imposed by circumstance, not choice. The Middletons became a warning story used by others. About social climbing, about reaching too high, about what happens when ordinary people get too close to power. This symbolic role was imposed on them, not chosen. It followed them regardless of their silence. There was no public breakdown, no tell-all interviews, no grievances aired. This restraint prevented escalation but denied closure. The story never resolved because the Middletons refused to perform it for public consumption. What remains isn't a lesson or a moral. It's just reality. The Middletons didn't lose everything. They retained their family bonds. They kept their dignity. But they lost something that can't be measured or recovered. The ability to live unnoticed. Once the world's attention finds you, it never fully leaves. Their story sits uncomfortably between worlds. Too ordinary to be royal. Too visible to be private. Too restrained to defend themselves in a culture that rewards spectacle. There's no happy ending here. No comeback. No redemption arc. Just quiet persistence. The Middletons continue forward, carrying experiences they never sought and consequences they didn't anticipate. Their silence continues, not because they're hiding, but because they refuse to turn personal pain into public entertainment. This isn't really a royal story. It's a human one, about two ordinary people who worked hard, built something meaningful, and watched it crumble simply because they stood too close to history. And it remains unresolved, because real lives rarely offer the conclusions we want. Want more untold stories like this? Subscribe to see what really happens when regular lives collide with extraordinary circumstances.